You feel it before you even realize what's happening. A quiet pull, a warmth spreading through your chest that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with escape. And in that moment, you don't question it. You follow it. Because, for a few seconds, maybe even a few minutes, the noise inside your head goes silent. The restlessness stops. The ache you carry everywhere you go, in meetings, at the dinner table, in the middle of conversations you're pretending to be present for, it lifts. And that relief, that brief and beautiful silence, becomes the thing you spend the rest of your day chasing. But then, it's over. And the silence doesn't stay. The ache comes back louder. The restlessness returns heavier. And somewhere beneath the guilt, beneath the promises you make to yourself that dissolve before morning, there is a question you keep refusing to ask. Not because you don't know it exists, but because you're afraid of what the answer might reveal. Why can't I stop? Not won't. Can't. Because there's a difference, and deep down you already know it. This isn't laziness. This isn't weakness. This isn't a character flaw you developed because you made bad choices. This is something older. Something buried so far beneath the surface of who you've become that most people will go their entire lives without ever seeing it clearly. And that invisibility is exactly why it has so much power over you. Carl Jung spent his life studying the parts of us we refuse to look at. Not the polished version of ourselves we perform for the world, not the identity we've constructed from achievements and appearances and carefully managed impressions. He was interested in what lives underneath all of that. The unacknowledged fears, the unexpressed grief, the needs that were never met, and the wounds that were never named. Jung called this the unconscious. And he believed, with a certainty that made many of his contemporaries deeply uncomfortable, that everything we do on the surface is being driven by what we refuse to face below it. Lust, he argued, is not simply desire. It is not the body misbehaving or the mind going weak. It is the unconscious communicating in the only language loud enough to get your attention. And if you keep silencing it with shame, with willpower, with another promise to do better tomorrow, you are not solving the problem. You are deepening it. This is the truth that no one tells you when you're in the middle of the cycle. Because the world gives you two stories about lust, and both of them are wrong. The first story says lust is sin, that it makes you dirty and broken and morally inferior to people who have more self-control. This story produces shame, and shame, as any psychologist worth their training will tell you, does not heal addiction. It feeds it, because shame is pain, and when you are in pain, you reach for the thing that relieves it fastest, and so the cycle tightens. The second story says lust is just biology, that it's natural, harmless, and the only problem is how uptight you're being about it. This story produces numbness. It gives you permission to keep going without ever asking why. And so the cycle continues, but now with a philosophical justification attached to it. Jung offered a third story, a harder one that requires you to stop blaming your body and stop dismissing your conscience, and instead turn toward the one thing you've been most carefully avoiding. Yourself. Not the version of yourself you show the world, the version that lives in the dark, the version made of everything you were told not to feel, everything you learned to hide, everything that got buried when you were still young enough that you didn't even understand what was happening to you. That version of you is still there, and it is running more of your life than you know. Think about the last time the urge hit you. Really think about it. Not the moment you gave in, but the moment before. What was happening? Where were you emotionally? Were you bored? Were you lonely? Had something happened that made you feel small, or invisible, or like you weren't quite enough? Had you just had a conversation that left you feeling disconnected? Had you been working so hard, pushing so relentlessly, that something inside you simply snapped and reached for the fastest available relief? Most people never stop long enough to answer those questions, because to answer them honestly is to admit something uncomfortable, that the lust was never really about lust, that the desire was never really about desire, that what you were actually reaching for in that moment was not pleasure, It was escape. And escape is always, always a response to something you don't yet know how to face. Jung described this mechanism with a concept he called the shadow. The shadow is not your evil side. It is not the dark twin lurking inside you, waiting to destroy everything good. The shadow is simply the repository of everything you have disowned. Every emotion you were taught was unacceptable. Every part of your personality that got punished or ignored or shamed into silence. Every need you learned to suppress because expressing it made things worse instead of better. The shadow is where all of that goes, and it doesn't disappear there. It grows. And here is the crucial thing about the shadow that most people miss entirely. It does not express itself directly. It cannot. Because the whole reason those parts of you ended up in the shadow in the first place is that direct expression was dangerous. So instead, the shadow disguises itself. It puts on a mask that your conscious mind finds acceptable, or at least irresistible. And for millions of people, that mask is lust. You think you want the image on the screen. You think you want the body, the fantasy, the dopamine surge that comes from the chase. But what the shadow behind that want is actually reaching for is something entirely different. It is reaching for connection, for warmth, for the feeling of being wanted, of being chosen, of being seen and not found lacking. It is reaching, in its distorted and desperate way, for love. But it cannot ask for love directly, because somewhere along the line, asking for love became dangerous. Maybe it got you rejected. Maybe it got you mocked. Maybe you watched someone you loved ask for love and get hurt for it, and you decided unconsciously that you would never be that vulnerable. So the need went underground, into the shadow, and the shadow found a way to get something that looked like connection without the risk of real exposure. Lust became the compromise, the fake version of intimacy that could give you the sensation without the vulnerability, the simulation of being chosen without the terror of being truly known. And it worked, for a while. But here is what the shadow does not tell you about this arrangement. It is not sustainable. Because the thing you are actually starving for cannot be fed through fantasy. You can consume endlessly and still wake up the next morning hollow, because what you consumed was not what you needed. You gave the body sugar when the soul was asking for bread. Jung believed that the shadow, left unexamined, will eventually consume you, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but slowly, gradually, the way a room gets darker when no one remembers to open the windows. You start making choices you don't fully understand. You start feeling like a stranger to yourself. You start noticing a growing gap between the person you present to the world and the person you secretly know yourself to be. And that gap, that private, unspoken distance, is not just uncomfortable. It is exhausting. It takes enormous energy to maintain. And the more energy it takes, the less you have left for anything that actually matters. This is the first and most foundational layer of what keeps you trapped. Not lust itself, but lust as a shadow in disguise, as a masked messenger carrying a message you haven't yet been willing to hear. So what do you do with this? Not what most advice tells you to do. Not suppress it harder. Not shame yourself more thoroughly. Not install another filter or delete another app or reset your day count and promise that this time will be different. Those approaches treat the symptom. They do not touch the wound. What Jung would have you do is far more difficult and far more powerful. The next time the urge rises, instead of immediately acting on it or immediately trying to crush it, pause. Just for a moment. Sit with the discomfort of the gap between what you want to do and what you actually need. And in that gap, ask the only question that matters. What am I actually feeling right now? Not what do I want? What am I feeling? Because there is something underneath the wanting. There always is. And when you find it, when you sit still long enough to feel the loneliness or the anger or the grief or the shame that was there before the urge even arrived, something begins to shift. Not dramatically, not immediately, but something shifts. Because when you stop running from what's underneath, the underneath starts to lose its power over you. The shadow does not need you to fight it. It needs you to see it. And the seeing, the honest and compassionate seeing of what is actually there, is where the long road toward freedom begins. You are not broken. You are not beyond help. You are not destined to spend the rest of your life managed by a cycle you cannot name. You are simply someone who has been running from a part of yourself for a very long time. And the part of you that is tired of running is the part that brought you here. That exhaustion is not weakness. It is the beginning of something. It is the first crack in the wall. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply let the wall crack. Now go deeper. Because understanding where lust comes from is only the first layer. What drives it, what sustains it, what happens in your brain and in your soul when you follow it again and again, that is where the real revelation waits. There is a lie your brain tells you every single time. It is not a loud lie. It does not arrive with fanfare or warning. It arrives quietly, almost kindly, like a whisper from someone who knows exactly what you need to hear. It says, this time will be different. This time it will actually satisfy you. This time the emptiness will fill. This time you will feel what you've been looking for. And you believe it. Not because you are foolish, but because the feeling that precedes the act is genuinely, neurologically, overwhelmingly convincing. That feeling has a name, and understanding it might be the most practically important thing you do in this entire journey. Dopamine. Most people think dopamine is the pleasure chemical, the reward, the thing your brain releases when something good happens, but that is not quite right. And the difference between what dopamine actually is and what most people believe it to be is the difference between understanding your addiction and remaining completely confused by it. Dopamine is not the reward. Dopamine is the anticipation of the reward. It is the chemical of wanting, not of having. It surges not when you get the thing, but when your brain believes the thing is coming. And this distinction is everything, because it means that the most intense neurological experience in the entire cycle happens before you do anything at all. The craving itself, the pull, the irresistible magnetic draw toward the fantasy or the screen or the behavior, that is the dopamine peak. And what comes after, the act itself, is almost always a letdown by comparison. This is why the cycle never ends on its own. This is why willpower alone fails so consistently and so completely. Because your brain is not addicted to the experience, it is addicted to the anticipation. And anticipation is infinitely renewable. You can want something forever. You can never have it forever and keep wanting. The wanting does not depend on the getting. In fact, the getting often makes the wanting worse, because now your brain has confirmed that the reward exists, that it is accessible, and that it is worth pursuing again. Jung did not use the language of neuroscience. He was writing decades before the mechanisms of dopamine were understood. But he described this dynamic with a clarity that remains remarkable. He spoke of what he called the inflation of desire, the way the psyche builds up a fantasy object, whether a person, an image, an experience, into something it never actually was and never could be. And the inflation is always greater than the reality. So the reality always disappoints. And the disappointment drives you back to the fantasy, where the object can be reinflated to impossible proportions, and the wanting can begin again. It is a closed loop, a perfectly designed trap. And the trap is not located out there in the world, in the screens or the images or the circumstances that trigger you. The trap is located inside your own nervous system, inside the very architecture of how your brain assigns value and motivation and meaning to the things you pursue. This is important because it means that removing the external triggers, while sometimes useful, will never be sufficient. Because the mechanism that produces the craving does not require specific triggers to function. It is generative. It will find new triggers, or it will create the sensation of wanting in context where no trigger was present. People who understand this stop being surprised when they relapse after weeks of discipline, after removing every app and blocking every site and surrounding themselves with accountability. The mechanism was not in the phone, the mechanism is in the mind. But here is where it gets truly interesting, and where Jung's framework goes somewhere that pure neuroscience on its own cannot follow. The dopamine cycle is not just a biological malfunction. It is not simply a brain running a faulty program. It is a symptom, and what it is a symptom of is the absence of something far more fundamental than pleasure. It is the absence of meaning. Jung believed, and the evidence of clinical psychology has continued to support this belief across decades, that the human psyche has a central drive that is not pleasure, not safety, not even love, but meaning. The need to feel that your existence matters, that there is a reason you are here beyond the mere biological fact of survival, that the story of your life is going somewhere, is building towards something, is connected to something larger than the daily management of your own comfort. When that need is met, even partially, even imperfectly, the pull of cheap stimulation weakens considerably. Not because you have more willpower, but because the emptiness that lust was trying to fill is no longer as empty. When you are genuinely engaged with something that matters to you, genuinely in pursuit of a goal that carries weight, genuinely connected to people and purposes that give your days a texture and a direction, the appeal of the dopamine substitute drops. Not to zero, but to something manageable, to something that no longer feels like the only relief available. But when meaning is absent, when you are moving through days that feel identical and purposeless, when you are performing a life rather than living one, when the gap between who you actually are and who you are pretending to be has grown so wide that you have stopped even trying to close it, then lust does not just appeal, it dominates. Because it is the only thing in your environment that reliably produces the sensation of aliveness. And this is a crucial point. The sensation of aliveness. Not actual aliveness, not genuine engagement with the full depth and difficulty and richness of being a conscious human being, but the sensation of it. The chemical simulation, the neurological echo of what vitality feels like. And for many people, that simulation is the closest they get to feeling truly alive in their daily lives, not because they are damaged or hopeless, but because the modern world has become extraordinarily efficient at removing the conditions under which genuine aliveness tends to emerge. Real challenge, real uncertainty, real depth of connection, real engagement with the parts of existence that are uncomfortable and unresolved and cannot be optimized away. Instead, the modern environment offers an endless supply of simulations. Simulated connection through scrolling, simulated achievement through gaming, simulated intimacy through fantasy, and the brain cannot always tell the difference between the simulation and the real thing, at least not immediately, at least not until you have been running on simulations for long enough that the original, the actual lived experience, starts to feel foreign and inaccessible. Jung called this process the loss of soul. And while that language might sound dramatic or metaphorical to modern ears, what he was describing is something deeply practical and recognizable. It is the experience of feeling hollow in the middle of your own life, of going through the motions of existing while something at the center of you remains untouched, unreached, unsatisfied, of performing normalcy while carrying a private, inarticulate awareness that something essential is missing, and you don't quite know what it is or how to get it back. That hollowness is what lust rushes in to cover. Not to fill, because it cannot fill what meaning carved out, but to cover, to paper over the void with sensation long enough that you don't have to feel its edges quite so sharply. And this is why simply removing the behavior, even when you manage it, so often produces what people in recovery call the dry drunk phenomenon. You stopped doing the thing, but you didn't address the emptiness that the thing was covering. So the emptiness is now completely exposed, and you feel worse, not better, in those early days or weeks of abstinence, not because the behavior was actually serving you, but because at least while you were engaged in it, you weren't having to sit alone with the void. This is the layer that most willpower-based approaches to overcoming lust completely miss. They assume that the problem is the behavior. Stop the behavior, problem solved. But the behavior was never the problem. The behavior was the solution, a terrible one, a self-defeating one, but a solution nonetheless to the actual problem, which is the experience of living a life that does not feel meaningful, connected, or fully inhabited, which means the path forward is not primarily about resistance, it is about replacement. Not replacement in the shallow sense of finding a new hobby to keep yourself busy, but replacement in the deeper sense of building genuine meaning, of engaging seriously with the question of what actually matters to you, of doing the difficult and often uncomfortable work of aligning how you spend your days with what you actually believe your life is for. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming fully and authentically yourself, as the central task of human psychological development, and he believed that almost all persistent suffering, including addiction, was at root a symptom of arrested individuation, of a person who had stopped moving toward their own authentic depth and was instead circling endlessly in the shallows. The question this raises is not, how do I stop? It is, who am I becoming? Not what do I need to avoid, but what do I need to move toward? Not how do I manage my weakness, but what would it mean to genuinely inhabit my strength? These are harder questions. They do not have quick answers. They do not produce measurable results by Friday. But they are the questions that actually address the problem. And the willingness to sit with them, to take them seriously, to let them reorient the way you understand your own life, is itself a form of healing. Because when the mind stops running towards simulation and starts moving towards substance, the dopamine trap begins to loosen. Not all at once, not without struggle, but genuinely, measurably, progressively. And there is another layer beneath this one, a layer that goes back further than your adult life, further than your conscious memory, a layer that explains why some people seem to struggle with this far more intensely than others, even when their circumstances seem broadly similar. A layer that has to do not with what you are doing now, but with what was done to you then, when you were still small enough that the world felt enormous and the people around you were everything, because the child you were is still inside you, still waiting, still wanting, still reaching for something that was withheld long before you had the language to name what it was. And what that child is carrying is the weight of every moment of connection that never came. Every time you reached out and found nothing there. Every time you needed to be seen and were overlooked. Every time the warmth you required was replaced with distance or criticism, or simply the crushing indifference of adults too, consumed by their own unprocessed pain to notice yours. You did not forget those moments. You could not. The body keeps a record that the mind cannot erase. And the longing that those moments created, the hunger for being truly known and truly accepted and truly loved without conditions or performance, or the constant anxiety of potentially getting it wrong, that longing did not go away when you grew up. There is a moment that comes for everyone who has been in this cycle long enough. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with clarity or resolve, or any of the dramatic conviction you imagine transformation would feel like. It arrives quietly, almost accidentally, in the middle of an ordinary moment. You are sitting somewhere unremarkable. Maybe you are tired. Maybe the day has been long, and the familiar pull is already beginning its slow rise at the edges of your awareness. And something inside you, not your willpower, not your discipline, not the part of you that makes promises and breaks them, but something deeper and quieter than any of that, simply says, I am done. Not done in the way you have said it before, not done as a declaration made to yourself in the mirror or written in a journal entry that you will reread with embarrassment 6 weeks later. Done in the way that a body stops reaching for food it has finally recognized as poison. Done in the way that grief ends, not with a decision, but with an exhaustion so complete that the grief simply has nowhere left to live. That moment is available to you. It may not feel close. It may feel like the furthest thing in the world from where you currently stand, but it exists. And the path toward it runs not through greater discipline or stronger walls or more elaborate systems of self-management. It runs through understanding, through the kind of deep, honest, compassionate understanding of yourself that most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. Carl Jung said something that has stayed relevant far beyond the era in which he said it. He said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Read that again, because it is the most accurate description of what is happening to you that you are likely to encounter. The cycle that feels like fate, the pattern that seems to return no matter what you do, the sense that you are somehow doomed to keep repeating the same defeat. That is not fate. That is the unconscious operating without your awareness. That is the shadow directing your choices from a room you have never entered. This is what the final layers of understanding ask of you. Not performance. Not willpower. Not a better version of the same suppression you have been practicing for years. Something entirely different. Something that requires a kind of courage most people do not associate with this struggle at all. The courage to feel what you actually feel. Not the curated version. Not the emotions you have decided are acceptable and appropriate and manageable. The real ones. The ones that live beneath the surface of your daily functioning. The grief you have been carrying since something happened that you never fully processed. The anger that never had a safe place to land and so turned inward and became depression, or outward and became compulsion. The loneliness that is so chronic and so deep that you have almost stopped registering it as loneliness and started mistaking it for just the way things are. Those feelings are not your enemy. They are not evidence of weakness or instability or the kind of inner chaos you have been quietly afraid of for years. They are information. They are the language your inner world uses to communicate what it needs. And you have been refusing to listen for so long that the messages have had to get louder and more insistent and more disruptive to get any attention at all. Lust, in this framework, is simply a very loud message. It is the psyche screaming in the only register you have left yourself able to hear. And the appropriate response to a scream is not to silence it. It is to find out what it is screaming about. Jung spoke extensively about what he called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche, when given the right conditions, to move beyond the opposition between the conscious and the unconscious and to find a third position, a synthesis, a new understanding that integrates what was previously split apart. And he believed that this integration, this drawing together of the parts of yourself you have been keeping separated, was not just psychologically beneficial. He believed it was the central movement of a genuinely human life, the movement toward wholeness. Wholeness does not mean perfect. It does not mean the absence of struggle or temptation or the full spectrum of human darkness. Wholeness means integrated. It means that the parts of you that have been living in exile, in the shadow, in the carefully managed distance between who you are and who you allow yourself to appear, have been welcomed back, not indulged, not given free rein, but acknowledged, understood, given a proper place in the full picture of who you are. And when that integration begins to happen, something remarkable occurs. The compulsive charge around lust starts to diminish, not because you have become more disciplined, but because the energy that was sustaining the compulsion was always the energy of the rejected and unacknowledged parts of yourself. And when those parts begin to be seen and integrated rather than suppressed and shamed, they stop needing such extreme measures to make themselves heard. But there is something else that needs to be said here. Something that the purely psychological framing, as valuable as it is, sometimes leaves out, and it has to do with the relational dimension of this struggle. Because while everything we have discussed so far has focused on the internal architecture of the problem, the wound, the shadow, the dopamine mechanism, the search for meaning, none of that healing happens in isolation. Human beings are not designed for solitary transformation. We are relational creatures. We were shaped by relationship in the earliest days of our lives. We were wounded, most of us, in the context of relationship, and we heal, ultimately, in the context of relationship as well. This means that part of the path forward involves learning to do something